and welcome. Today you were hosted by Moore Kingston Smith, so the organisation I work for. The lovely Vanessa is actually helping in the background, and just enjoy the session. For the attendees online here, please join in. Please actually put details into the chat. Please make as much use of the guests as you can, and just looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So how we're using the chat and the Q&A chat is exactly what it says on the tin, for you to raise points, comment to each other on what you're hearing, what you're seeing, what you're thinking. And the Q&A button at the bottom is specifically for you to raise questions which we'll put to the panelists during the course of the evening. Now, having said that my dogs had evacuated the room, I've discovered that one of them, probably because she's so small, only 9 stone, who was lurking in a corner and has stayed in the room. So you may be joined by a Newfoundland at some stage during the course of the conversation. So the order of events for this evening then is, in a minute I'm going to introduce our speakers for this evening, the panel. Sorry, she's got her squeaky toy back here. I'm going to, which I've now confiscated. I'm going to introduce the speakers, who are going to talk about their thoughts and views on the components of social investment, one from the perspective of running an investee organisation, very successful one, and one from running an equally successful fund or a set of funds. So different perspectives there. Then we're going to, after a few remarks from Mark and me, we're going to be doing a poll question to get you to give your thoughts. And then we're going to go into a Q&A with the panelists, where we'll be posing your questions to them, or a range of other questions. Please don't make me have to think up and use my own questions, because this is your time to ask. So if I can then just introduce our panelists tonight, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to be speaking. First off will be Ben Rick, who is the founder or co-founder and CEO of Social and Sustainable Capital, which had been around, I think, actually formed in 2014, although you were working on it for a year and a half prior to that. He was formerly with UBS and Merrill Lynch. As I say, he co-founded Social and Sustainable Capital in 2012. That has a number of funds, but focusing generally on disadvantaged communities, and doing that in a way that is not only socially positive, but sustainable in the way it's invested and the things that they're supporting. So that's Ben, and he will no doubt tell us more about what he's up to as we get into the conversation. And to join him is Louisa Mitchell. Similarly, she has an investment banking background, has then moved over to sustainability after careers latterly with Goldman Sachs, but prior to that with Deutsche Bank and Schroders. Then found herself running the Whitley Fund for Nature, has then moved over to being a research director at the Policy Exchange, and moved over to NGO management in Hong Kong. So if you want diversity of career, I think Louisa is one of several who can fulfill that for you. Where I met her was co-developing the West London zone, which she has run successfully for 5 years, 6 years, Louisa? 7 years. Time flies when you're having fun. It was and remains the first collective impact bond developed with social investment backing, helping school-age children in West London. But I'll let her explain a bit more of that when we get into the conversation. So, first of all, components of social investment, your own views and thoughts. Ben, tell us what you think.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I also just want to keep an eye on the time. So as Jim said, so SAS SAS was actually founded in 2012. We launched the funds in 2014, and so we've been going for 7 years, investing for 7 years, and I would describe those 7 years as kind of 50% bitter struggle, 50% kind of increasing success. So the increasing success really started from 2018. Kind of the struggle was before that. So kind of I speak to you now on the verge of actually trying to coming close to achieving some of the scale and the impact that we hope to achieve when we set out, although it's taken quite some time to get here. And I thought that was important to say, because in kind of before discussing the different components of successful social investment, I actually thought it was useful to think about the fact that successful social investment is a relative concept, and it very much depends on where you are in the ecosystem of what you may or may not think is successful. So and I think I'll just talk through that a little bit, and I think it will help to explain why this is such a difficult area to work in. So from the point of view of a borrower or an investee like Louisa, without doubt, successful social investment means the cheapest money you can find, and the most hands-off money that you can find, the least reporting requirements. From an investor's perspective, the best successful social investment is the best financial return you can get, and receiving loads and loads of detailed impact data that helps you justify to yourself and others what a great job you're doing. For a fund manager like SAS, the best kind of social investment is one that pays a great fee and is easy to execute, and it's also probably an environment where you have a few number of competitors. And if you're a market building organisation like Big Society Capital, potentially, potentially you want a marketplace where there are lots of players with lots of innovative solutions, which are really hard to develop and hard to execute. So it isn't just a matter of, when you say what's successful social investment, it does very much depend on your perspective. And so I guess, if you're trying to think overall, what's the most successful, component of social investment, you have to think about a compromise of kind of all the aforementioned issues to come up with a solution that works for everybody and gives everybody a bit of what they need. And that's the only way you're going to achieve longevity and anything like the kind of scale that everyone needs for this to be a really productive endeavor. Now, to achieve that longevity and that scale, ultimately what this all comes down to is product design. And this has been the tricky piece, I think, for social investors. And when we talk about product, what do we mean? We mean the actual way in which you move capital from those that have it to those that need it. So you're talking about designing something that appeals to investors and appeals to borrowers. And I think that's potentially where in the early years of social investment things didn't go particularly right, because what you had was a bunch of people, very well-meaning, myself included, came from finance, and actually the perceived problem was that the social sector needed access to finance, and actually that they didn't even really know what they needed, because they weren't finance people, they were charities, and it wasn't very commercial. And so what social investment initially did was sit around in a room and not really talk to anyone and design a bunch of products that ultimately no one wanted, and then was quite surprised when no one wanted them. And the analogy that we give is that if you went to the board of Coca-Cola, you didn't find them sitting around in a room kind of talking about why no one was drinking their drinks and what was wrong with the consumer's taste buds. That's not what happens. If Coca-Cola launches a drink and no one likes it, they stop making it, and it's not like a discussion. That's just the way it happens. And I think that, so if I think about SAS journey from where we started and where we got to, I think the transition from us from those years of struggling to those years of success really came around, what essentially Coca-Cola does in its consumer groups it was about listening and respecting the consumer. So, you know, the average person that doesn't drink Coca-Cola hasn't got a clue how to make it. But that doesn't mean that Coca-Cola doesn't listen to them when they say they don't like it or they do like it. They're being an expert practitioner and liking the end result are two separate things. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I think what I would say from SaaS perspective is we did the equivalent of the consumer group and spoke to people that really knew about what it was they wanted. And we did all the right things. And I think actually having done all those right things, we were still lucky to find a product that could scale and could generate impact. And I have to say, I'm very hopeful that we'll find another one. Who knows if we will or we won't. It isn't easy. But what we did in our case was we gave ourselves the best opportunity to find something that works and works really hard, and it panned out. But it's still, even doing all those things, it's still not easy, because there are just some challenges, and maybe we'll come on to them in the questions about social investment, which just make it really hard to do. But I think at the core of it, if you're thinking about product design and how to make something work in this space, what you need to focus on, and specifically for us, what SaaS focused on, is what we could learn about finance from our customers who weren't finance people, not what we could teach them. I mean, you have to turn up. Obviously, the nuts and bolts and how you make the products work and how you do the legal documents, that's, you know, the issue is what, in terms of what the customer really needs, what charities really need to unlock their ability to scale, that's got to come from them. And in many cases, it will be quite unique to different organizations, but in some cases, there'll be some synergy there in a way to extract something that works for others. And we've been fortunate to be in that position. So just going one, you know, keeping an eye on the time. So just going one level deeper than that. I mean, I think ultimately, actually working co-design, genuine co-design, there's another important layer to that, and I think that I'm sure Louisa will touch on this, and it's relationships. And you know, I'm sure, you know, in this discussion it will come up more than once. But you can't have true co-design without a relationship that actually really does level the playing field and allow people to sit around the table and talk openly. And so that's one way that I think, you know, so as a slight aside in a way, you know, social investors like SaaS, what we spend a lot of our time doing is translating. So, and you know, a lot of the time we will talk to investors and understand what they want and what they look for, and then we translate that and we relay that message to our charities. And then we receive information from our charities about what they're doing, and we translate that into a language that we can give to our investors. That's quite hard, but it's doable, and it's something that over time, you know, you get better at, and it is a skill, but it's quite achievable. Actually, the one thing that we've noticed as we're becoming bigger and more successful is actually the really tricky thing is when you, as an organization like SaaS, when we need to talk and to two completely separate two separate audiences. So we have to, with our website and with our materials and with our fundraising, we have to be able to speak in a way that appeals to investors but doesn't alienate charities, and at the same time appeals to charities and doesn't alienate investors. And I think that's much harder than perhaps we realize. And if we're really going to grow social investment to have the level of potential success we all want it to have, it's going to require us to be able to speak out of kind of both sides of our mouth at the same time with increasing frequency. And so I think when we're thinking about success, that is one of the things we need to bear in mind, and it definitely plays back to you know, the different ways in which people might measure success in the first place. I think that's 7 minutes. Shall I stop?
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. You packed a lot into that. Expecting no less, you, Louisa, because I know some of what you've achieved at West London Zone, to say the least. Your views on the components of social investment, your experience.
Yeah, so in terms of the components of successful social investment, as Ben said, it is subjective about what is successful. And I'm going to come on to that once I have explained what we do and our funding model, because I have learned with West London Zone that it's better to get it out there clearly what we do and what our funding model is before going into any other points, otherwise it results in a ton of questions. I have been at West London Zone 7 years because it was a year to design our model with a local steering group, and it was then a year to pilot it. And then we've been running our model according to our social investment funding model for the last 5 years. So it's also been a bitter struggle with increasing success, to quote Ben. I'm not sure I can actually even claim 50-50 yet, but it's a running theme, that. So just to summarise what we do, we work in one place in a zone in West London. And if you drill into the data in our zone, it is the most unequal place in the country. What that means is that there are pockets of deep deprivation, and there is significant hidden, depending on how you think about it, need. And the children who would most benefit from support don't get it. And when they do, it's too little, too late, and it's fragmented. And it's really easy to disengage from. Our analysis says that in our zone, there are 60,000 school-aged children. We work with school-aged children aged 3 to 18, and 1 in 5, that's 12,000, are at risk of dropping out of school with low or no grades, poor mental health, leading to social isolation, unemployment, and the downward spiral that can develop from that. So we designed a delivery model that enables us to find these children. So we proactively find the children. We don't take referrals because it's too late by then. And we do that through a kind of data-driven and relationship-driven approach. And then we provide them with a kind of 360 wraparound support model that helps them to build the relationships and skills they need to get on track socially, emotionally, and academically to thrive into adulthood and to prevent them falling through the cracks. And I'm just going to explain to you exactly how that works, because it's all driven by our funding model. So we do it in deep partnership with schools in a two-year sort of personalised programme for every child that has 3 components. One is a West London Zone link worker who's based full-time in school, working with 30 or 40 children and building a trusted relationship with the child and their family, designing their 2-year plan with them and their teachers, setting goals and targets and enabling the child to achieve them. So that's a West London Zone link worker employed by us. That's our front line. I don't like that expression, but just to be clear. 2 is the specialist support, which we bring to the child through our sort of 80 or so charity partners working locally. And they deliver the specialized services like therapy, tuition, woodwork. And we ensure that that specialist support works the best it can for every child by personalizing it and actually performance managing it. And the third part is joining up the system of support for every child. So all the professionals that work in a child's life, and that's teachers, social services, the police, and other community representatives, so that everything's coordinated, there's no duplication and there's no waste. And just to give you an example, you know, we're working with 3-year-olds who start nursery, barely able to speak, in some cases mute, and we are giving them all the support they need so that they go into school age 5, speaking, ready to learn, playing with their friends. We're working with 13, 14-year-olds who are clocking up serious numbers of behaviour points and detentions, on the brink of exclusion, which almost always results in disastrous outcomes, who we re-engage with school and learning, develop their self-esteem, enable them to develop hobbies, and many of them have gone on to get 7 GCSEs and are now studying and in work. So we're taking children who are going down one trajectory, and we're enabling them to totally shift their trajectory in life. And as I said, we have multiple roles in order to join up the system, to find the children, join up the system, and performance manage all of their support. And that was because of the diagnosis at the beginning that that's what was missing. Couldn't find the children, everything was fragmented, and they weren't getting the support they needed. We also believed at the beginning that the way the money works was part of the problem. And we wanted a funding model that would actually solve the problems we'd diagnosed in our place and would drive our collaborative delivery model, as well as ensuring this laser focus on every child so they couldn't fall between the cracks. And making the support really personalized so it was the best it could be for every child. So what that model is we have outcomes-based contracts from schools, local councils, central government, which is big lottery money, and private commissioners like Bank of America. And they commission us to deliver milestones with every child. So to be clear, they pay us when we provide evidence that we've identified a child and signed them up for the programme and designed their plan, when they engage with a certain amount of support, and when they meet certain social, emotional, and academic milestones. So that's multiple commissioners and a multi-stage payment model. And the contracts are for 5 years, so that we have longer, not long enough, but longer term visibility. And they also drive us, we need to work really collaboratively with local stakeholders to make this delivery model work. And these contracts really drive that collaboration. So that revenue, that pays us for our link worker and our backbone service, so our coordination service, and we use it to pay our partners who are delivering the specialist support. We don't pay them on outcomes. Everyone always asks me that. We take all the outcomes risk, and we manage that on the ground through our link workers. They are essentially our risk management and our performance management tool. We do pay our partners on a per child, per session basis and delivery of data. And just to finish on the structure, in order to make this work, we have a loan from a social investor, and that provides the working capital for us to do the work, including to pay our specialist delivery partners before we can provide the evidence to our commissioners and get paid. So that social investor shares the risk with us of not performing, so the children not meeting the milestones, but they also share in the upside of us performing and meeting the milestones. They get a higher return on their loan if we do well. That loan sits on our charity, our organisational balance sheet. We don't have any special purpose vehicle. We don't have any other governance structure. It's very simple. We are operating to a blended financial model. So those outcomes-based contracts are around half our revenue, and the rest comes in the form of grants from trusts and foundations, individuals and businesses. In terms of how we've done, we broadly met or exceeded our performance targets. They had to be renegotiated as part of COVID, but aside from that, we've met them, and we've had an analysis of the savings done, and our analysis shows that we've saved around £44,000 per child to the state. And in terms of an organisationally, in the 5 years that we've been operational, we've grown from supporting around 100 children in 3 schools and 1 council to around 1,400 children in 45 schools in 4 councils, and that's growth of about £500,000 to £5.5 million. And that's absolutely been driven by the outcomes contracts. We had a loan of £550,000 in the first 4 years, and now we have 1.1 million. And so what have been the key, if this is indeed a success, what have been the key factors of that? Well, I think success is subjective. I think it has been a success in that we have delivered some very positive outcomes with children and young people. We've worked with about 2,000 children and young people overall so far. And we've met the success targets in terms of those outcomes. Actually, in terms of the number of children we're working with, it's a lot lower than the original vision. And I think this goes to Ben's point about that original vision, and those hugely ambitious targets were before the product had been really designed. And when we came to design the product and we realized, what that product really needed to be, actually, we had to rein in the ambition on size and number of children we could work with over time. And I don't think that's not a success. I think you need to have big ambition and big vision to do stuff that's different. But that is how it is. In terms of how we've done with those children that we have worked with, which is still a significant number of children, the success rates have been really good. And I think the key components of that are, just to summarize, 3 things. One is really, really strong partnerships. So I think it's really important to find the right partnerships and get the right relationships in place and establish really clear guidelines for how they're going to work. So in terms of the investor, it's worth spending a lot of time to find the right investor and get really clear on the structure, to be very clear on where the accountability lies, where the control lies, so things are completely crystal clear on both sides up front. In terms of the commissioners, that is just an ongoing relationship management requirement. I have really detailed relationship management plans for every single commissioner. It's just how it needs to be. And in terms of delivery partners, although they're all offering a separate service into us, it's really important that they understand the whole. So that's a lot of stakeholders, it's a lot of partners, and it takes a lot of resource that shouldn't be underestimated. And I have continually underestimated it, but it shouldn't be underestimated. The second component of success is structure, and I tried to keep the structure as simple as possible. It doesn't sound very simple, but I did try to keep it as simple as possible. And at one point, with regard to the social investment piece, we strayed into discussions about special purpose vehicles and multiple vehicles to take different revenue streams into different vehicles with different governance structures. And I'm really, really glad that we didn't keep it simple, so that it's really clear where the ownership and accountability lies, is my view on why that's worked. And the final thing to say is, as a charity CEO, I think part of the success was the moment I realized it's not a grant and it's going to cost money, and I've got to accept that, which maybe sounds a bit foolish, but I'm someone who really counts our pennies and wants to spend all the money that I can on the children. But the reality is, to share risk, to get the expertise and the supports that's needed, it costs. And there's no doubt in my mind that it's driven our collaborative delivery model. It's held us to account for every child. It's absolutely enabled personalization and flexibility in dramatically changing conditions for children over the last few years. And it's really driven transparency and accountability and our success in delivering outcomes with children. But it costs. It costs money, and it took me a long time to get over that. But having done that, I think it's been a good structure for us.
Thank you very much, Louisa. I think you're right. It was very helpful to explain what you're doing before we dive into some of your conclusions. Mark, would you like to make a few remarks on what you've heard before we try people out with the poll?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the first thing to say is you've got two very different views from Louisa and Ben, but they're both great at relationships. They're both great at
similar
creating
themes coming through,
you know, creating the bond, Jim. So I mean, you know, for me, it's about, you know, this honesty, this language, and it just feels really lovely the way that both have talked about, if you like, this from the investee and the investor position. And what Ben said was, you've got to find something that appeals to charities but doesn't alienate investors, and appeals to investors but doesn't alienate charities. That's the balance, that's the tightrope, if you like, that you're walking. The second thing that I wanted to say was what Louisa just said at the end. You stole my thunder, Louisa, you see. This is not a grant. And, you know, certainly in the early days of social investment, but even more towards the later stage, you see people really either going to one position, I understand what social investment is, I really understand what investment does, I'm going to have to pay back that money, or they think it's a grant. It's not a grant. Yeah. And so really understanding the dynamics of using that money in the right way, how to scale up if you need more, and what success looks like is critical. And so the final thought, Jim, is just the successful social investments that we brought out in the book and that I've witnessed. There's 4 different components. And if you're a socially motivated investor, you start with this social hurdle. You then look at the team and the culture, and we haven't talked about that yet a lot, Jim, but I believe that agility of team and culture is critical. Then it looks at the finance, then it looks at the business model. Whereas actually, if you're a much more, if you like, finance first investment or investor, you start with the business model, you go to the finance model, you look at the team, and then you finish with the social hurdle last. So even though we've got the different components and we've got the same components playing out, it's the way that people interact with those conversations and find that alignment that works for them, Jim. So those were kind of my thoughts, and just two fantastic speakers.
Indeed. Thank you very much, all of you. Mark, shall we see what some of the audience are thinking? Sadly, Paddy's having to leave us, but I hope you'll listen to the recording later on, Paddy. But let's put up there the poll. We've just got one simple question just to get your views on a subject. Can we pop that up on screen, Mark?
Can.
So everyone who's here, which do you think is the single most important component of getting social investment right? You just get one choice on this. I'm not sure which one you have to choose to appeal to Louisa or to Ben in particular, but no doubt they'll comment in a minute. So do add your views. We just want to get a straw poll of people as to what you're thinking about this. Okay, we can see those moving and developing. Do put your answers in. I think we have the rule here that panelists and Mark and I aren't allowed to vote because we would skew it too much. We would either draw Ben and Louisa together in a beautiful social investment relationship for the future, or we'd alienate the pair of them, put them in opposite corners. But how are we doing? We got any more to vote? There's about half of you have voted so far. It's all right, we're not tracking who's saying what, so you are allowed to say anything you like within reason, as long as it's one of the listed answers. Louisa, Ben, Mark, can you see the voting on the screen? Yeah.
Yeah. So what I've done is I've finished the poll, Jim. So okay. you can kind of like sort of make your thoughts and comments from there.
Right. Okay. In which case, we've got very interesting. I do wonder whether some of these have been steered by what we heard coming through so loud and clear from Ben and Louisa about relationships and how they're managed and how they're developed. But we've got half of you thinking the most important thing is the relationship, presumably between funder and funded, and the other one is the successful alignment of motivations. I'm implying in that between the funder and the funded. Ben, do you have any thoughts on what we're seeing on screen?
Yeah, I mean, those are. I mean, I guess the other stuff is kind of. The other stuff is sort of hygiene factors, which can be expressed in numbers and and words quite clearly. But yeah, the relationship and the alignment is what's tricky. I mean, if you don't have a good relationship with and I think this is one of the problems with social investment is there's so few deals to some extent that often charities and investors end up working together when perhaps they, in another market where there was more choice, you might not end up being thrown together because there's not always that much choice. But yeah, I mean, you certainly with our transactions, they're 10 years, sometimes longer. So you want to be really sure that when you get into that relationship, it's going to be a good one. And I think the hard work does definitely happen after, it always feels like the due diligence and the investment proposition and going to investment committee, that's the hard bit. It tends not to be. It tends to be what comes after the deal is done that's more challenging. I mean, successful alignment and motivations, that sort of talks to what I was talking about before. I mean, I think, the job of the investor is to sit somewhere in between the investors and the charities. And if they do that properly, they can make the process work smoothly. That they might not always be completely aligned, but they're there as that translation mechanism to make it work for both sets of parties. And I think that is important. But yes, I mean, it's if you don't see eye to eye on the way things should be done, that's going to be challenging. Okay,
Louisa, you were talking about how the relationships. I got the impression they were developing. You were working hard on them. It wasn't just the commissioner relationships that required continuous work. What are your thoughts on alignment of motivation versus relationship rather swamping the whole funding and structure and so
on? I do think, I mean, certainly in our model where we've got 50 commissioners. We've got 45 schools, 4 councils, and Bank of America and others as well. And we've got, over 40 partners, charity partners that we micro commission, so to speak, and a social investor. I mean, if we weren't really clear about motivations and alignment and really clear about parameters for the partnerships, you can imagine, it would be very, very challenging. So I think that those are, really key components. But I think it takes, so we designed our model according to the principles of collective impact, as you know, and one of the 5 conditions for collective impact is what's called strong leadership, I think they call it. I do think it requires, just really real clarity. So it is about relationships, but they also need real structure and frameworks and clarity about what is being achieved and who is achieving what and where the different accountabilities and controls lie. So they're not just relationships for the relationship's sake. Like, there has to be really good frameworks and accountabilities in there.
Can I just develop that further in a point that I think Ben came up with originally, but I heard you touching on it as well, and I'm just going to unshare the results of the poll if I'm able to. Mark, can we pull the poll off screen now?
I've tried to do that. I don't know why it won't go, but never mind.
Okay, maybe we have to do it individually.
Yeah.
Ben, you were talking about building a relationship between the funder and the funded when there wasn't an even power and authority balance between the parties. I think that's how I picked it up. Do you want to comment a bit further on that, about how this relationship can happen, where perhaps you have huge strength with the funder and maybe less with the funded, or even desperation or whatever? And then Louisa, I'd like to bring you in after I've heard Ben's comments.
So I guess it's more, so I guess in the purely commercial world, an investor and a borrower, or an investor and an investee, will have a relationship where there's a very uneven balance of power. Typically, in the commercial venturing world, or private equity world, or even the lending with the banks, the investor or the lender has a huge amount of power, and you're able to have a relationship that exists in that way because borrowers or investees are pretty compelled to enter into financial transactions, and they're either compelled, typically they're compelled by the prospect of becoming wealthy. So there's a very clear motivation for someone to put themselves in a position where they have limited power, because there's a financial upside. Now, I think that when you strip out that financial incentive, and you have to redress the way that balance of power works, because for our charities that we work with, they're not trying to get personally wealthy, number one, and number two, they're actually quite risk averse because they're trying to maintain their social mission. So if you approach the problem with the same balance of power, it doesn't, our experience is it doesn't really work, and you have to accept at the very least a partnership way of working. And actually we found with the housing product that we've developed, you actually have to accept risk transfer. And this always slightly melts the brains of the lawyers that work on our product, because when we present them with the term sheets for the legal agreements for how our legal structures work, they can't quite get over the fact that, in a normal commercial transaction, the lender or the investor is nailing down every single risk imaginable onto the borrower, because that's just the way things are done. And they find it really, really hard in our structures that we make the transaction very borrower friendly, and that is, that's addressing the power balance. And if you don't do that, deals don't happen. I think that social investment, you're relying, that's where you are relying on the alignment of interest between both the parties to do the right thing. And you can't enforce by, if you try and enforce through rigid power structures, then nothing happens.
Could I get Louisa's thoughts on that power balance, and then I'm going to come to Alison, who has a question.
Yeah, obviously I don't see the bends both sides of it. I only see the side of it from the investee, and yeah, I'm not sure it feels exactly like that. I think you know, we are a borrower. We're a borrower. I mean, so there's a risk share, but ultimately, you know, we have to perform. So I think it's very clear between us and our social investor what the agreements are, but I'm not sure that I see it as smoothly.
Yeah, I think what's interesting there, if I can cut across you there, is it probably is different for different investors and different situations. And as is so often the case, even where an effort is being made to bridge a power balance, there is a different perception on both sides of the line.
Yeah, I would add that probably the product that Louisa, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but Louisa, the product that is the basis of your investment and the product which is the basis of our investment with our borrowers is quite different.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's a very diverse market. At the risk of shutting you both up, I'd like to open the door to Alison, who's patiently had her hand up for several minutes. Alison, what would you like to ask the panel?
Thanks, Jim. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. Louisa, this question is for you. The West London zone, was it established on a social investment funding model? And the question is, what advice would you give to more established charities who have maybe a bit of a way to go to get their head around moving from grant making to social investment?
Hi, Alison. We did a pilot project that was grant funded because we wanted to see if we could actually get this kind of collective impact multi-stakeholder model to be operational. It felt pretty ambitious, and we found through the pilot project we could. And so, yeah, that was like a 6 to 12, we call it a year's pilot project, which is actually more like 8-9 months. And from there, we then went into our social investment model. So I guess it kind of was founded on a social investment, but we did trial it without first. And to be honest, that was pretty key. That pilot project was pretty key in giving us the confidence to move forward with the social investment model. And even when we did, you know, we had very little data that told us that we were going to achieve the metrics. And I guess that's why I just can't quite respond in the same way as Ben, because as a startup, it was I found it very stressful in the early days. You know, the risk that we're taking in terms of whether we could deliver to those metrics. And that's just the reality of it. It felt like an enormous pressure to deliver. But it is built in and baked into our model, and it has served us really well. So it was worth it, but I'm not going to pretend that it wasn't a huge risk to burden for the first few years, even with a social investor. So in terms of your advice, more established charities, God, Ben might be better at this. I guess the bit that's kind of baked in for us is that it's a collaborative model, and we've always been data driven. So when we started, there were conversations about, you know, do you want to work with someone out? I mean, it's not a very big market, as Ben said, which is also a problem, but, you know, do you want to work with social finance or someone who does, you know, all your performance management and your data collection? And I remember I always said, well, why would we do that? Like, we need to keep that learning in-house. This is like our core model. This is integral to us. We wouldn't outsource that. That wouldn't work. But so it was very baked into us that we were data driven. We were always going to be transparent and accountable and share our data and performance with all of our commissioners and stakeholders. But I guess for an established charity, you know, maybe you're not like sharing data to the level we are and performance data to the level we are with funders and stakeholders. And that's probably a big shift. But I think the other shift is the fact that it costs money. as I said, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I found that really hard. So data and money, I think.
Thank you, Louise. Can I take a question from Susan, and then I'd like to come back to Alice Wyborn.
Good evening,
Susan,
thank you. I'm here, thank you. I wanted to pick up on something that Ben said earlier on about the role of translator, because that very much reflects my own experiences in that as a charity starting a journey now to secure that investment. I find that we are hugely confident and knowledgeable about our own strengths and weaknesses and businesses and our activities, but putting those into a frame that presents the skills we bring to what is ultimately a partnership to deliver our mutual outcomes, useful. What I'm finding interesting is how I can draw skills back from the other side, not just the money, but how can I draw the skills in that partnership so that we're both contributing skills and capacity as well as the financial transaction to make it work.
So is the question, how do you get the partner to give you more than money?
Well, yes, but how can I, because I firmly believe it's a two-way thing, that actually a funding partner I would expect to bring some skills and capacities that as a charity I'm unlikely to have. However, I also personally believe that as a charity I carry skills and expertise that my funder is unlikely to have. And I'm interested in how we can broker that part of the relationship alongside the funding agreement.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's...
I think it's a bad question and you want to laugh at me, I won't be offended.
No,
I haven't given up on yet.
I guess I think the answer is, I mean, I think this is kind of exactly what I was alluding to when I said you have to be really careful who you end up getting into a relationship with in terms of the provision of finance, because, yeah, I mean, you know, not everybody in social investment is going to be able to give you the things that you think they'll be able to give you. And certainly not everyone in social investment is going to be prepared to take from you the things that you know. And that's hard. And I think, you know, in the big bad commercial world where there's hundreds of providers of finance, you just talk to many, you know, investors until you find the one where you think there's a mutual understanding of how you both want to operate. The problem with this space is it's small, so sometimes, yeah, you know, I mean, for some products in social investment, you essentially have a choice of one person to talk to. There isn't a choice. It's their way or the highway, and that makes it difficult. I think so. To the extent to which you can change the way people behave, I don't know, but I do think you have to be very comfortable before you get into a transaction, especially one where there is a significant burden on you as a charity in terms of reporting and performance, and where the documents can allow for, you know, a level of intervention if that things don't go to plan. You have to be very careful you're setting out on a journey with the right counterpart.
Thank you. Can I follow up on that, Jim? Is that okay?
If we're quick, because I need to get Alice's question before we finish as well.
Fair enough. I wanted to ask Louisa, because off the back, I firmly believe that actually my ambitions for outcomes are higher than the funder at the moment. So that, I can live with that. But Louisa, everybody calls these things partnerships. Does it feel like a partnership?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, it does. It does. But it just takes a lot of work, which I underestimate at every turn.
Thank you.
I think from what I hear, and this is not just from Louisa's experience, it is a partnership, but as we so tritely say about matrimonial partnerships and that sort of thing, these things take a lot of work, and they take continuous work and communication to deal with the changing external environment. I think it's absolutely true here. Alice, you've been patiently sitting there with your hand up. You must be getting an aching arm. Alice, your question, please.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm finding this conversation really helpful. I have a quick question for Ben. You spoke about kind of acting as almost a translator between the social investors and the charity. As someone who's on the charity side, I wondered, in your experience, kind of what are the most common mistakes you see charities making in how they present themselves to social investors?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a very good question. The common mistakes in the way they present themselves. So I think there is sometimes a bit of a lack of precision in the way that proposals are presented. And again, I think that part of the problem here is that in the more commercial world, there are very clear rules of engagement about what is expected. And if you were if you were a mainstream financial organisation, you wanted to approach someone for investment, it would be very clear what the organisation you were going to talk to required, and there'd be people who were very able and capable to help you put together something that would be exactly what was to be expected. So I think one of the issues is I've always said one of the reasons why social investment feels like it takes so long is because I think unusually the potential borrower or investee starts talking to the social investor very, very early on in the process, when ideas are maybe only kind of roughly formed in their mind. And I think that can sometimes, that is a bit of a mistake. I think it is worth investing the time such that there's not too much back and forth around quite basic aspects of the way an opportunity is presented, because I think there's people form an impression quite early on, and if things are bought half-baked, it's quite hard to undo that perception of a lack of understanding. So spending time and effort to get things into shape before putting it in front of a social investor, I think, is probably one of the mistakes that organisations make. I'd say the other mistake they make is that people tend to be either wildly optimistic or way too pessimistic about what they're presenting. I actually think the wildly optimistic one is worse, because it's very easy to then just dismiss what's being presented. But I think as organisations, and kind of alluded to it before, charities are quite risk averse, but you want to be careful not to be too conservative in the way you present, because I've always said this to people, that the first thing any investor does is kind of haircut whatever's put in front of them. So if you start from a position of severe conservatism or pessimism about the way things will go, that doesn't help.
Indeed. Thank you for that, Ben. There's one that I would just add, which I've seen on several occasions, is too much. There are many hit charities with a great and illustrious history. There tends to be too much focus on the history and what we did 157.5 years ago when we were founded, and not enough on and what we're going to do now and what the need is now, which is actually the bit that's going to be backed. So can I just take a question from Catherine, and then I'm going to ask for a couple of remarks from Mark before we close this evening. So
thank
Catherine.
you so much. Thank you. Can I just say you've been brilliantly honest about the struggles and some of the pitfalls and the length of time that it takes to get these ideas to delivery. As somebody who's just kind of feeling my way with this and seeing how it could work for the charity that I work for, can you give me some inspiration, some positives? I know that Louisa already alluded to the fact that it really helps with driving accountability and things like that. So what are the really good bits about getting into social investment?
Was that for me?
Either or both.
Can we take let's take Ben and then comment from Louisa.
I think in the I would have handed this over. She's dropped off, but we have one of our investees was on the line a minute ago. It's no longer here. But I would say that what we've seen organisations be able to do with the right kind of capital is just amazing. I mean, it's literally, it has to be right, and it has to be extremely well thought through, and you have to have the right executive team and the right board, and most importantly the right opportunity and the right source of income to repay a loan. But where you know, when it's right, it's amazing, and it doesn't work for every charity in every situation, and there needs to be a very commercial business model that supports taking on investment. But it's, you know, I'm proud of the stuff we've done in 7 years at SAS and anything else I've done in my career. It unlocks amazing potential in organisations that are full of extremely capable people who dedicate their lives to improving the welfare of disadvantaged people. I mean, it's an amazing thing, but it has to be right, because it's not, you know, it's not easy, and it shouldn't be done lightly. But when it works, it's you know, it's a really fantastic opportunity, I think, for the space. Okay. And we're very lucky
Louisa,
to have a social investment market that works.
Louisa, your thoughts on that same topic, inspiration from your experience of social investment?
Well, it has enabled us to have a transparent funding model where the money really follows every child. And, you know, this country's been writing policy papers for years on the fact that, you know, we don't need project funding, we need transparent funding where the money follows every child. And that's what our model does. So it holds us absolutely accountable for every single child. And I think it's been fantastic for that. You know, that has driven partnership, it's driven collaboration. It means we have about 2% dropout from our program. You know, most charities are around 30%, 20 to 30%. It's been fantastic for that.
So achieving things that wouldn't otherwise have happened, and I'm struck by that bit. You were slightly apologising for not helping quite as many children as the original ambition suggested. But for goodness sake, you talked about 2,000 children who probably otherwise wouldn't have been helped in anything like the way you're talking about. That's an amazing thing that wouldn't have happened without the investment. Mark. Thoughts to close.
So we've only got 1 minute just to get there before we close, and I'm gonna try and be totally focused. And it's funny because I had 2 or 3 points written down, and I suddenly wrote down a Billy Joel lyric, about honesty, because, you know, what I love about Ben and what I love about Sask is that, you know, Ben's always taught the language that the social investment is difficult to find the right alignment, but actually sometimes you can't go into it thinking you're going to make huge amounts of profit. In other words, you have to adjust your market rate of return. And Louisa, on the flip side, you've talked about just how difficult it is servicing the social investor all the way through. And so it's just that honesty and trust, And I was going to sing Billy Joel, but I don't think I will, Jim. So I mean, that was just a very
possibly a relief to many.
Oh, it was for everybody else on the call as well. So that was my one wrap-up comment, Jim.
Okay, well, thanks ever so much, not least to our 2 panelists. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Really rich conversation, some interesting questions from the audience. This is one of a series of these discussions. The next one is scheduled for the 9th of November, which is about due diligence, managing risk, which Ben and Louisa both mentioned, investment readiness, and yet again, that theme of having the right mindset coming through, because the culture and the intellectual side is so important. The one after that's on the 7th of December, which is about accounting and impact measurement. So we will be sending out more details about when those are. Do come and join us for those. And again, thank you so much, Louisa and Ben, for your insight, wisdom, and coming back to that key word, honesty. It's been so helpful to those who are starting to tussle with social investment. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.